Before my boots even touched the wet sand of Omaha Beach, 3 men standing in front of me were already dead. The heavy steel ramp of Higgins Boat 16 slammed down into the churning foam of Sector Easy Red, and the sharp metallic rip of German machine gun fire tore from the concrete casemate of bunker Widerstandsnest 62 high on the bluffs above us. Men to my left dropped forward into deep ocean water, their heavy wool coats soaking up water and pulling them under like lead weights. I lunged over the steel lip into the sea, my Red Cross armband already soaked in salt water and blood. I grabbed a wounded private by his shoulder harness, dragging him behind the rusted iron legs of a Czech hedgehog while mortar shrapnel whistled through the thick smoke. I did not know it yet, but that horrifying moment was only the beginning of what Normandy would demand from the 16th Infantry Regiment. The morning of June 6, 1944, did not begin with a bugle call or sunrise in transport quarters. It began hours earlier in the dark belly of the transport ship USS Charles Carroll, surrounded by the stench of vomited rations, the clatter of heavy machinery, and the icy slap of the English Channel against steel hulls. I was 21 years old, a farm boy from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, who had enlisted believing that a Red Cross armband meant something holy, that mercy stood above slaughter on the battlefield. When the ramp plummeted into the gray surf at 6:30 in the morning, well off the coast, that belief dissolved faster than drawing a single breath. The ramp dropped with a hollow metallic clang, like a massive door slamming shut in a tomb. Instantly, the world around us exploded into red tracer fire, spraying salt and deafening explosions. The coxswain had hit a submerged sandbar far short of dry land, leaving 36 terrified soldiers standing in waist-deep water under direct enemy observation. Before anyone could shout a command, heavy 7.92 millimeter machine gun fire swept out from the concrete embrasure on the ridge. And the opening volley tore through the wooden interior of our landing craft. 3 young replacements standing in the front row collapsed backward into the bilge without a sound, their wool jackets turning crimson before their boots even touched the channel. "Get off! Get off the ramp!" Sergeant Donald Briggs roared from behind me, striking my shoulder harness with his fist to shove me into the open air. "Move off the ramp or die in the box." I lunged over the side, plunging headfirst into deep ocean water. My equipment pulled me straight to the bottom like an anchor. My waterlogged wool trousers clung to my freezing legs, and the 2 heavy canvas medical pouches strapped across my chest slammed against my chin. Bitter salt water filled my nose and throat, tasting of spilled diesel oil and churning sand. For several terrifying seconds, I tumbled in underwater darkness, my jump boots scraping sea gravel, while brass buckles threatened to keep me pinned beneath the waves. I clawed upward through white foam with desperate strokes, breaking the surface just as German mortar shells detonated along the sandbar. Hot shrapnel hissed around my ears as it quenched in the freezing spray. All around me, the sea turned a sickly brownish pink as arterial blood mixed with churning foam. The hand-painted Red Cross emblem on my M1 steel helmet offered no protection against the hail of lead. I wiped blinding spray from my eyes and looked up at the bluffs. Enemy snipers positioned near the cliff line were actively targeting the white circles on our helmets, treating them as bullseyes. A short distance to my left, a young rifleman from Company E thrashed helplessly in the waist-deep tide. His M1 Garand rifle was tangled in its web sling, and his heavy field pack had become completely waterlogged, dragging his head beneath surging waves every time he tried to push upward. His eyes were wide with terror, and his knuckles turned paper white around his rifle stock. I scrambled toward him through the surf, the heavy current dragging against my thighs with every step. I knelt beside him in the freezing water under a hail of machine gun spray. I grabbed the boy by his coat collar, hauling his head above the foam while mortar shells erupted in the water behind us. "Drop the pack!" I screamed into his ear, though my voice was nearly swallowed by naval salvos firing from battleships miles out at sea. "Unbuckle it, son. Unbuckle it now." Deafened by the noise and stiffened by biting cold, his fingers clutched uselessly at his canvas straps. Seeing he could not free himself, I pulled my heavy bandage shears from my pocket and slashed through his canvas shoulder straps with 2 sharp tugs. The heavy field pack slipped away into the dark swell, sinking instantly to the seafloor. The boy gasped violently, heaving as he coughed up seawater and bile into the waves. I grabbed the collar of his soaked wool jacket with both hands, hauling him through knee-deep tide toward a sandbar where a few survivors were clustering behind a Czech hedgehog. For a few suspended seconds behind the heavy iron beam, the world seemed to contract into absolute stillness. I leaned my back against the cold steel of the hedgehog, my forehead resting against my knees, listening to the heavy thud of my own heart echoing inside my wet helmet. For a brief moment, the roar of artillery receded, and my mind flashed back to the peaceful green pastures of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, the quiet mornings before dawn, when the only sound was the wind rustling through the cornfields. But a sudden spray of seawater snapped me back to the reality of Easy Red. We crouched together behind the angle iron of the obstacle, while 75mm artillery rounds exploded along the waterline. Cold sea foam splashed over my back, stinging in open cuts on my knuckles where I had scraped against iron fittings. Corporal Joseph Vance was already crouching there, clutching his brass rosary in mud-stained hands, his lips moving in silent prayer between explosions. "Keep your head down, Miller," Vance shouted over the roar of naval guns. "The gunners on the bluffs are watching for the Red Cross on our steel pots." The open beach ahead stretched for a massive flat of wet sand, completely exposed to interlocking fields of fire. German machine guns turned the shore into a fury of spray, flying pebbles, and shredded equipment. The sound of their fire was not the distinct popping of our Browning rifles. It was a continuous, mechanical rip, like heavy canvas being torn apart by giant hands. We reached the base of the sandbar and collapsed face first into the cold granite gravel. The air directly above our heads was thick with the thud of stray bullets and biting shrapnel. Every round that impacted sent wet grit into my eyes, ears, and mouth. The bitter taste of dry sulfa powder burst open inside my canvas pouch, clung to my tongue, mixing with the metallic scent of iron rust and blood in the sea fog. "Miller, keep your head down!" a harsh voice barked beside me. I turned my head to find Corporal Joseph Vance kneeling behind the vertical beam of the hedgehog. His Red Cross armlet was torn at the seam, stained with dark grease and sea mud. His face was pale as chalk, but his eyes were sharp and focused as he clutched his brass rosary in mud-stained hands. His thumb worked the metal beads with frantic speed every time an artillery shell detonated along the waterline. His right hand was pressed tightly against his upper thigh, where seawater had turned his wool trousers black. "Vance, are you hit?" I yelled, dragging the gasping rifleman into the partial lee of the iron structure. "Not me. The boy from 3rd Squad," Vance shouted back, his voice trembling above the din. "Hold the artery before you touch the bandage, Arthur. Remember Dorset. Hold the damn artery." He gestured toward a shell crater, a short crawl away, where 2 infantrymen lay motionless in the froth. The tide was advancing with terrifying speed, rising continuously and pushing white foam higher up the beach flats. If non-ambulatory wounded were not moved off the open sand, The rising channel would drown them before any medic could stanch their bleeding. Above us, cordite smoke and gray drizzle hung over the imposing cliffline of Widerstandsnest 62, where twin muzzle flashes protruded from a heavy concrete casemate high above the Colleville draw. German gunners swept their heavy weapons in overlapping arcs, locking fields of fire onto Sector Easy Red and trapping dozens of soldiers behind landing craft ramps and iron hedgehogs. "We have to get out to that crater," I shouted, my hands trembling as I unbuckled the soaked leather strap of my medical kit. The biting cold had turned my fingers completely numb. Rubber tourniquets inside felt slick and frozen in my gloves. "Look at your helmet, Arthur," Vance rasped, grabbing my sleeve and jerking me down as a stream of machine gun rounds whipped past, striking the iron beam with a deafening ring of steel. Sparks flew right before my eyes. Vance pointed directly at my forehead. "The gunners on the ridge are watching for white circles. They think we're line officers directing the landing. Scoop up mud, cover the cross." I did not hesitate. I reached down into the wet sand, digging my fingers deep into freezing sludge, and smeared a thick layer of mud over the Red Cross emblem on my helmet. Vance did the same, plastering his helmet until the white circle was buried beneath Normandy earth. The Red Cross on my helmet meant nothing on this beach. We were just targets in wool coats, caught between a rising tide and fortified bluffs. A sudden shockwave erupted in the surf behind us as a German mortar round landed directly among men jumping from another Higgins boat. A pillar of dark water and debris shot high into the sky. When the spray cleared, the sea was covered with floating helmets, canteens, and field packs, and the screams of survivors cut through the fog like razors. "Briggs!" Vance yelled, straining his neck to look back toward the foaming waterline. Briggs made it out. Sergeant Donald Briggs was wading through waist-deep surf, dragging a wounded lieutenant by his collar with one hand while holding his M1 Garand high above the water with the other. Briggs was 35 years old, a veteran of North Africa and Sicily, his face set in a grim, unyielding mask. He hauled the officer onto the sandbar and dropped beside us, behind the iron hedgehog. Without a word, Briggs reached into his breast pocket and pulled out his silver pocket watch. The glass face was webbed with sharp cracks, a streak of dark mud smeared across the casing. He stared at the hands for several long seconds, his jaw muscles clenched tight. 0645, Briggs muttered, his voice cold, flat, and utterly devoid of emotion. 15 minutes since the ramp went down. Half the company is scattered across the beach. If we don't blow the barbed wire at the base of the bluff before high tide, we're all going to be floating face down in this ditch. He looked directly into my face, but his eyes were vacant, passing right through me as if looking at a ghost. I recognized that look, the expression of a veteran who refused to learn names or look into the eyes of young replacements, knowing half of us would not live to see the afternoon sun. "Medic!" a desperate voice shrieked from shallow water a short distance ahead. "Medic! For God's sake! My leg! I'm stuck!" It was Private Jenkins, an 18-year-old ammunition bearer from my battalion, pinned beneath the heavy wooden beam of a Belgian gate obstacle blown apart by an artillery burst. The rising tide was lapping at his chest, cold foam swirling into his mouth every time a wave broke over the sandbar. "Stay down, Briggs!" I shouted, pushing myself up from the wet gravel despite the hail of fire. "Miller, don't you dare go out onto that open flat," Vance warned, reaching out to grab my sleeve. His eyes flashed with sudden, guarded dread, a secret he harbored alone amid the slaughter.
I'm going!"
I yelled back, tearing my sleeve from his grip. I crouched low, keeping my chest flat against the wet sand, and began low crawling through the sea foam toward Jenkins. Every few seconds, heavy machine gun rounds bit into the gravel around my boots, throwing cold water over my back. The metallic smell of blood mixed with rust in the surf, filling my lungs with an odor so rank I bit my lip to keep from retching. Seawater was sweeping over Jenkins's face when I reached him. He was coughing violently, his eyes wild with the terror of drowning in knee-deep water. His left trouser leg was shredded from knee to ankle, exposing severe wounds and torn muscle that turned the sea foam crimson around his hips. "Hold on, son. Hold on. I've got you." I grunted, wedging my shoulder firmly beneath the heavy timber of the Belgian gate. I heaved upward with every ounce of strength, my muscles straining under the weight of wet oak and iron fittings. The heavy wood shifted just enough for Jenkins to drag his mangled leg out. He screamed in agony, cut short by another burst of machine gun fire striking the timber directly above my head. I grabbed Jenkins by his armpits, my elbows digging into the gravel, dragging his waterlogged body inch by inch toward the cover of the shingle wall ahead. The shingle was an embankment of smooth gray granite stones pushed up by Atlantic storms, the only place on Omaha Beach where a soldier could lie flat without being torn apart by direct fire from the German bunkers. As we collapsed together behind the stone wall, an eerie quiet settled over our immediate position. Behind the high granite embankment, the deafening chatter of the machine guns sounded muffled and distant, as if filtered through thick cotton. For 2 quiet minutes, nobody spoke. The men around me lay flat on their stomachs, pressing their wet faces against the cold stones, their shoulders heaving in deep, exhausted gasps. Corporal Vance sat beside me, closing his eyes as his mud-stained fingers moved slowly along the brass beads of his rosary, murmuring a low Latin prayer that was lost in the sound of the surf. In that strange pocket of stillness, I carefully bandaged Jenkins's leg, pulling the rubber tourniquet tight while the boy lay breathing softly against the granite. I unbuckled my kit and pulled out a roll of heavy cotton bandage. I wrapped Jenkins's leg tightly, applying a rubber tourniquet above his knee until the dark arterial spurting slowed to a trickle. I poured a full envelope of white sulfa powder into the open wound, watching the powder absorb into the torn tissue. "You're going to make it, Jenkins," I whispered, tying off the bandage straps. "Keep your head down and stay against the stones." Sergeant Donald Briggs lay beside me, his face caked with stone dust and wet sand. He kept pulling his silver pocket watch from his jacket, flipping open the cracked glass face with a trembling thumb, counting the seconds between the mortar tube's discharge on the ridge and the impact on the shingle wall. 7 seconds, Briggs growled, his voice raspy from diesel smoke and salt spray. "They are adjusting 40 yards to the east. If we stay glued to these pebbles another 5 minutes, we will all be buried in them." Corporal Joseph Vance lay right beside me, his long legs stretched down toward the foam of the rising tide. The water was washing over his boots, dragging at his heavy wool trousers with every incoming wave. His skin had turned a waxy white from freezing spray and sheer exhaustion. With his right hand, Vance was clutching his brass rosary, his blood-stained fingers squeezing the metal beads so hard his knuckles turned pale. "Hold the artery before you touch the bandage, Arthur," Vance murmured, his eyes fixed on the gray clouds above the bluffs. He was repeating the very first rule he had taught me back at Fort Devens during training. "Don't lose your head over the screaming. Find the bleed." I yanked Vance by his web harness, dragging his lower body higher up the shingle slope, away from the surf. The tide was coming in with terrifying speed, creeping up the beach, swallowing abandoned packs, rifles, and motionless bodies left on the flats. We were rapidly running out of dry ground. If a soldier lost consciousness down on the sand, the ocean would claim him long before shrapnel could finish the job. I unbuckled my canvas medical pouch to check my remaining supplies. Ice-cold water had left my fingers almost completely numb. Inside, 3 rolls of Carlisle dressings were soaked with seawater and pink with thinned blood. The paper envelopes of sulfa powder had turned to a useless wet paste. I had 2 rubber tourniquets left, a pair of rusted shears, and a small metal tin containing 2 aluminum syrettes of morphine. Then came the sharp whistle we had all been fearing. It was not a distant whisper. It was a sharp tear in the air, directly above our heads. A sound so loud, my stomach dropped into absolute ice. "Get down!" Briggs roared, driving his face into the sharp granite pebbles. For 3 terrifying seconds, no sound remained, only a high-pitched whine vibrating inside my skull. Then the air cleared of dark dirt, and the screaming began. I pushed myself up onto my elbows, spitting grit and dirt from my mouth. The mortar round had detonated near our right flank. 2 riflemen from Company E lay motionless in the crater, half covered by displaced pebbles. Right next to me, Corporal Vance had been thrown onto his back by the blast pressure. "Joe!" I yelled, scrambling over the shifting stones on my hands and knees. Vance did not answer. His eyes were wide and vacant, staring up at the gray rain falling from the sky. A jagged piece of hot mortar casing had caught him across the lower abdomen and upper thigh, ripping open his heavy wool trousers. Dark arterial blood was spreading rapidly onto the gray shingle, steaming in the cold, salt air and soaking into the stones around his hip. "Arthur!" he gasped, his mouth working uselessly as white foam formed at the corners of his lips. "Arthur, I can't feel my legs!" "Briggs, help me with a tourniquet!" I screamed over the endless hammer of machine guns on the ridge. Briggs scrambled over on his knees, his face pale beneath the grime. He pulled out a rubber strip and wrapped it around the upper portion of Vance's leg, twisting it tight with a wooden peg until the spurting slowed to a dark trickle. But the wound in his belly was far too deep. The shrapnel had shredded through his side, and no rubber strap could stop the catastrophic internal bleeding taking place inside his body. Vance's chest heaved in shallow, rapid gasps. His fingers, still tangled in his brass rosary, weakly brushed against my wrist. "It's cold, Artie," he whispered, his voice dropping to a papery rattle. "The sea, is it coming up?" "No, Joe. You're on the wall. You're high up on the stones," I lied, my voice breaking as I ripped open a Carlisle dressing with my teeth and pressed a thick cotton pad into his side. The white cotton turned crimson in seconds. "You're going home, Joe. Just stay still. Keep holding the artery." "Medic!" a lieutenant screamed from a few paces away, grabbing my shoulder with his good hand. "I need morphine! My squad leader is up at the wire with the Bangalores!" "His legs are pinned under a timber, and he can't set the fuse unless he gets something for the pain." "Where is your morphine?" My hands froze, still pressed firmly against Vance's bleeding abdomen. My fingers slipped inside the wet canvas of my pouch and touched the small metal tin. I opened it. Inside, only one aluminum tube remained. The second syrette had been crushed into flattened foil by a flying stone during the blast, its clear liquid wasted in the dirt. I had one single dose of morphine left on the entire sector of Easy Red. I looked down into Vance's pale face. Joe was my instructor. He was the man who had shared his dry socks with me in the staging area in England. The man who had prayed over every casualty we loaded onto the Higgins boats during maneuvers. He was dying right in front of me. The signs were unmistakable. His lips were turning blue. His pulse was a faint, thready rhythm against my thumb, and his eyes were beginning to fix on nothingness. Without morphine, his final minutes on Earth would be an agonizing nightmare of burning shrapnel wounds and suffocating shock. With it, he would sleep peacefully as his life slipped away. "Give it to me, medic! That's an order!" the lieutenant shouted, his voice cracking under the deafening thrum of machine gun fire above. "If we don't blow that wire in 3 minutes, the tide will drown every man on this beach." Joe's trembling eyes locked onto mine. He did not ask for the drug. He did not beg. He just held up his bloodied hand, his fingers slipping off the brass rosary, his eyes pleading for a small mercy in the middle of hell. "I'm sorry, Lieutenant," I whispered. I did not look back at the officer. I pulled the small aluminum syrette from the metal tin with my left hand. With my teeth, I bent the wire loop back and forth until the sealing pin snapped, exposing the hollow needle. I grabbed Vance's upper shoulder, drove the needle straight through the wet, mud-caked wool of his jacket, and squeezed the flexible aluminum tube flat until every drop of clear liquid was injected into his shoulder muscle. The lieutenant swore a bitter curse at me before turning around and scrambling back up the stone slope toward his men without looking back. I stayed on my knees beside Vance, keeping my palm pressed firmly over his bandages. "The tide," Vance murmured, his voice fading like a distant echo over the roar of the surf. "It doesn't feel cold anymore, Artie." "I know, Joe," I said, holding his freezing hand in mine. "It's warm. The sun is coming out." He closed his eyes, his breathing growing fainter until his chest gave one last shallow sigh and went completely still. The brass rosary fell from his limp fingers, sliding down into the gray pebbles beside his hip. I picked up the small metal cross, wiped the dark smear from the brass with my sleeve, and slipped it deep into my front tunic pocket. There was no time to mourn him on that slope. "Miller!" Sergeant Briggs yelled from partway up the embankment, crouching beneath the lower strands of heavy concertina wire. "Get up here! Help haul these pipes! We are blowing the line now." I wiped my face with a blood-soaked sleeve, grabbed my heavy medical bags, and scrambled up the stone slope on all fours. Every time my boots dug into the shingle, pebbles slid backward, but I fought my way upward until I collapsed beside Briggs in the dirt right below the wire. Under the shadow of the wire, a tense silence gripped us. 2 combat engineers from the 37th Engineer Combat Battalion were lying flat on their stomachs, pushing long iron pipe sections filled with high explosives under the tangled coils of wire. Nobody spoke a word. The only sound was the heavy breathing of the engineers and the sharp metallic click as they threaded the second pipe into the first, their bare hands covered in deep cuts as they forced the iron through brush and dirt. "Hold this joint," one of the engineers whispered in a raspy voice, his face caked in oil and sweat. "Don't let it twist while I screw the sleeve on." "Fuse is set," the second engineer whispered, attaching a mechanical friction igniter to the blasting cap at the end of the tube. 5-second delay. "Get down." Sergeant Briggs pulled his silver pocket watch from his jacket one last time to count down the ignition. But just as he held it up, a stray bullet snapped through the air and struck the watch right in his palm with a sharp metallic clink. The silver casing shattered, internal gears popping into the dirt, and the hands stopped dead at 7:14 a.m. Briggs did not even flinch. He dropped the ruined silver shell into the mud, grabbed his M1 Garand rifle, and pressed his helmet flat against the rocks. "Fire in the hole!" The engineer yelled, pulling the igniter wire. A thick plume of white smoke spouted from the tube, followed by a fierce, sizzling hiss. We held our breath as the fuse burned down the narrow iron casing. 5 seconds felt like 5 hours. Then, the earth beneath us slammed upward with a concussive roar. The Bangalore torpedo exploded with a blinding flash of fire and a shockwave so powerful it knocked the wind out of every man on the shingle wall. A massive curtain of dirt, torn iron wire, and shattered stones was hurled into the sky. "Up!" Briggs screamed, standing high on the shifting stones and raising his garand above his head. "Get off this damned beach! Move through the gap! Charge the bunker!" That was the last time I ever saw Donald Briggs alive. Grabbing my medical bags, I ran right behind the infantrymen, scrambling through the blackened gap up the steep, grassy slope of the bluff. Rain had made the mud slick, forcing us to grab at roots, torn grass, and bushes to haul ourselves upward. Above us, the concrete embrasure of the bunker was firing down toward the water, but we were climbing inside its direct blind spot. Near a shell crater halfway up the ridge, a wounded rifleman clutched his collarbone. "Stay flat," I yelled, pressing a Carlisle dressing against his wound. "Keep pressure on it. I'll be back for you." Leaving him in the crater, I continued the grueling climb. The high crest of the bluff was close now. Through the haze of cordite smoke, the dark slit of the machine gun casemate grew visible, its barrel red-hot, poking out from the concrete wall as it sprayed bursts toward the beach below. 3 infantrymen reached the edge of the communication trench, encircling the rear of the bunker. A fragmentation grenade was tossed straight into the open doorway of the bunker's rear access tunnel. A muffled blast echoed from inside the concrete walls, followed by a cloud of gray dust spouting from the embrasure. Heavy oak timber splintered, scattering smoke across the trench. The endless chatter of the machine gun suddenly cut out. My knees hit the damp earth as I pulled myself over the lip of the trench. A heavy, absolute silence fell over the crest of the bluff. After 5 agonizing hours of roaring fire, the sudden silence inside the concrete chamber was deafening. I stepped slowly into the pit of Widerstandsnest 62, my jump boots crunching over thousands of spent brass shell casings covering the floor. The air was thick with the heavy stench of burnt cordite, scorched paint, and hot machine oil, but no more rounds were cracking overhead. I walked to the main observation embrasure and looked out over the entire coastline below. From this high concrete vantage point, the whole beach lay exposed in breathtaking, tragic clarity. Every sandbar where our Higgins boats had grounded, every iron stake, and every Czech hedgehog we had crawled behind was visible. Down on the shore, the sea had begun its slow retreat toward low tide, exposing a wide, dark strip of wet sand strewn with wreckage. The ocean, that had been a raging wall of foam during the landing, now lapped gently against the French coast, dark, calm, and sluggish. Burning trucks, twisted radios, and orange lifebelts floated aimlessly in tidal pools. Near the bunker entrance, surviving medics set up a casualty collection point along the grass. Long rows of wounded had been brought up from the water's edge and laid side by side, covered with heavy wool blankets or green canvas ponchos. Walking down the row of litters, I stopped beside a body covered to the shoulders. It was Joseph Vance. His face was pale and clean, free at last from the terrifying tension that had gripped him in England. Kneeling in the gravel beside his body, my hand instinctively touched the left breast pocket of my tunic, feeling the solid weight of the brass rosary I had retrieved from his hand on the shingle wall. Vance's exact words on the ship returned to me: "Hold the artery before you touch the bandage." Beside him lay Sergeant Donald Briggs. His web belt was torn, and his canteen was flattened by shrapnel. Beside his hand in the dirt lay his silver pocket watch, shattered into fine cracks, its hands pinned at 7:14 a.m., the exact minute he had stood beneath the wire and ordered us to charge. He had not lived to take 3 steps past the crest, but his watch recorded the precise second his world ended. I picked up the cold silver casing, holding it tightly in my fist for a long moment before tucking the broken watch into my bag alongside Vance's rosary. The true psychological weight of survival settled heavily upon my shoulders. Why had those relentless bursts missed my body by inches on the sandbar while cutting down the men running directly to my left and right? Why had the mortar fragment that dented my helmet spared my skull while killing the medic standing beside me in the water? The red cross on my helmet was now caked in Normandy mud. The boy who left Pennsylvania was gone. All that remained was a medic carrying dead men's names in his pockets. As the tide slowly pulled back, leaving the empty Higgins boats resting on the wet sand, I looked out over the English Channel one last time. We had taken the beach, the draw was cleared, and the front line was advancing inland into the hedgerows. But for me, and for every soldier who survived the nightmare of Easy Red, a vital part of our souls would remain forever anchored to this cold strip of sand, trapped in the eternal rise and fall of the Normandy tide. If these men deserve to be remembered, subscribe, leave a like, and help keep their stories alive.